Greenland is back in the headlines, and most people are hearing the wrong story. Trump is talking about America controlling Greenland again. It's being framed as NATO strength and national security, like a weird Cold War throwback. But the top of the map is not nostalgia, it's geometry, because if you draw the shortest lines between Russia and North America, missiles, bombers, submarines, early warning radars, they don't go through Berlin or Warsaw. They go over the Arctic. And that's why Greenland is not just an island. It's a sensor, a platform, a pressure point. Russia understands this better than anyone. For decades, Moscow has poured money into the far north. Ports, bases, air defenses, icebreakers, the Northern Fleet. Putin doesn't talk about the Arctic like a distant frontier. He talks about it like a vault. What happens when the Arctic becomes the one place where three forces collide at once: Russia's nuclear shield, America's radar network, and a political showman's appetite for dominance? I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today I'll show you what Russia is actually doing in the Arctic, what it wants, and why Greenland is becoming a battlefield of signals without a single shot fired. Here's our roadmap for today. The heroic exploration myth. How the North became a stage for national ego. Stuck in ice, where the North Road is yet to become commercially viable despite the climate change. Populating the North, the Soviet Union's grand project of developing its North frontier and what changed after 1991. Putin's Arctic plan, what Putin wants in the Arctic and what he's doing to achieve it. The real danger. Why the real danger about an attempted US takeover over Greenland is not provoking Russia, but something entirely different. If you want more analysis like this, without slogans, without panic, subscribe, like, share, or join my think tank. PayPal or SuperThings help keep this work independent. Now let's start where the story really begins, with the myth that the Arctic is about heroism when it has always been about power. The heroic exploration myth. The early exploration of the Arctic is shrouded in myth. Whole generations were raised on the stories about fearless heroes who sailed off into the ever-icy ocean, not for any material gain, but to prove themselves, to map uncharted waters and expand the boundaries of the known, to make history. The truth is more mundane. Ships went north because merchants wanted something they could sell. First, walrus tusks, the seal skins, and whaling was a big industry. Whale oil and fat were valuable as fuel and raw material before people had cheap alternatives. So the Arctic discovery story is also a supply chain story. Early expeditions were financed by crowns, merchant companies, and later by states that wanted influence. A new route to Asia through the Arctic Ocean could cut time and costs greatly. If the route failed, the trip could still pay if you came back loaded with the right cargo. Then, in the early 20th century, a different motive walked in. This was the era when people were obsessed with records. They wanted to be first. They wanted admiration and fame. Aviation was new and fragile, with aircrafts crashing all the time, but that danger became part of the appeal, attracting people who wanted to do something nobody else could. That same type of people eagerly joined Arctic expeditions, and mass media made that drive contagious. Newspapers and radio turned polar trips into serialized drama. Now a country could watch its heroes in real time and feel proud without ever leaving the kitchen. That's when exploration became a stadium. The point was a public victory that the whole nation could boast and feel like a champion. The Soviet system loved this, not because it had an adventurous spirit, but because it wanted to beat the West in a spectacular way. If you claim you are building a new civilization, you need performances that say, we can do amazing things. The Chelyuskin story in 1934 is the clean example. The ship is trapped, crushed by ice, and sinks. More than 100 people end up on the ice floor. They build a camp and a rough airstrip while Moscow turns the whole ordeal into a national epic. Pilots fly people out. The rescue becomes a myth machine. It does not matter that the heroic feat is basically surviving a disaster. The narrative is what counts. If you want a glimpse into how these narratives shaped Soviet people and made them do things that were sometimes amazing but mostly terrible, check out my novel, The Prince of the Soviets. Set in the late 1920s, it follows the birth and early development of the Soviet supremacy idea.
Find out who he really is.
Officially, Klimrogov's biography read like something safe and respectable. A journalist from New York, a foreign correspondent working for a prestigious news agency. In reality, Klimrogov was a white emigre. And if that truth were ever exposed, he would be arrested on the spot.
Very interesting.
He came to the Soviet Union for one reason only, to find his wife abducted by the Bolsheviks. And he did find her, just not where he expected. It turned out she had caught the attention of the only red millionaire in the entire country, a man inexplicably allowed to run a private business in a state supposedly devoted to building socialism. A man powerful enough to break the rules in Stalin's Moscow.
Will you catch him?
We'll catch them all.
Stuck in ice. The Northern Sea route looks like a cheat. Europe to Asia, but shorter. A cleaner arc, fewer miles, fewer days at sea. People see that line and immediately imagine money falling out of the sky. On paper, the distance gap is real. A common comparison is Rotterdam to Yokohama. The Arctic route can be roughly 4,300 nautical miles shorter than going through Suez, depending on how you measure the path and conditions. Another comparison puts Dalian to Rotterdam at about 7,900 nautical miles via the Northern Sea route versus around 10,900 via the Suez route. That's weeks of life when you are a ship. But the Arctic is where a short line becomes a long list of conditions. A global shipping lane is not just a route on water. It's affordable insurance and schedules that customers trust. It's a lot of ports to restock on the way. It's tugboats, pilots, repairs, spare parts, medical evacuations, reliable communications, and rescue capacity when someone breaks at 3 a.m. The Arctic punishes every weak link. Weather flips fast. Darkness lasts. Ice behaves like an animal, unpredictable in its tracks. Even climate change couldn't simply open this road. Yes, sea ice has declined, but less ice can also mean more movement and mass. Younger, thinner ice breaks and drifts. Open water creates waves that beat up ships and shorelines. There are more storms and more fog. That's why the Northern Sea route is anything but safe and convenient. The best reality check is what big shipping companies actually do. In 2018, Maersk sent the container ship Venta Maersk through the Northern Sea route as a one-off trial. The point was to learn, and Maersk's position afterward was blunt. They did not see the Northern Sea route as a viable commercial alternative to existing east-west routes. There's also the political layer. Ships on the Northern Sea route need permits from Russian authorities. That alone changes the risk math for a global company. If your shortcut runs through someone else's gate, it can become a toll booth or a trap overnight. Populating the North. Since the Bolsheviks seized power, they believed a world revolution was imminent. Capitalism would collapse and all countries would merge into a single global Soviet state under Moscow's leadership, of course. By 1927, that illusion had faded. Stalin pivoted to rapid industrialization and militarization, aiming to turn the USSR into a fortress powerful enough to dictate terms to the world. That required money, and money came from raw materials, many of them located beyond the Arctic Circle. No one wanted to work there unless paid extravagantly, so the state sent Gulag prisoners instead. This was never about profit or efficiency. It was about preparing urgently for a war that seemed inevitable and was. They built regardless. Entire cities above the polar circle, mines, railroads, power plants, ports, and industrial civilization on permafrost. Norilsk is the classic case. It sits atop some of the world's richest nickel, copper, and palladium deposits. Strategic metals the Soviet state was willing to extract at any human cost. Later, after World War II, the Arctic economy grew a second engine: incentives. The Soviet state began paying people extra to live and work in the far north. Northern wage coefficients, northern bonuses, early retirement rules, extra vacation. The state kept people there by money, status, and the promise that you can earn a better life faster than in the south. That's also when the shift work model becomes normal. Rotational crews, fly in, work hard, fly out. It's cheaper than building a full happy city for everyone. And it's easier to control. The party believed developing the North was non-negotiable, whatever the human or economic cost. It was meant to be a pillar of the vast socialist camp economy. But it was ruinously expensive. Everything costs a lot more. Construction, maintenance, transport, and emergency response, and permafrost is not stable ground. It shifts, cracks, melts, and punishes lazy engineering. I have a video touching on what it is like to live in a city built on permafrost, like millions of Russians still do. That's why the Soviet model of Arctic exploration depended on two cheats: coercion and subsidy. Forced labor lowered costs in the ugliest way, and state planning hid losses in a giant budget, making them appear small by comparison. After 1991, both cheats broke. When the Soviet system collapsed, many Arctic towns stopped making sense. Mines closed, subsidies shrank, and people began to leave. Vorkuta is a good snapshot. No roads connected to the rest of Russia, and whole settlements around the mines have emptied out as the coal economy weakened. Putin's Arctic turn. Putin keeps talking about the Arctic as our treasure chest, our highway, our destiny. But his real motive is a new source of leverage he could use against the West. And he wants a stage where Russia can look bigger than its economy. The Northern Sea Route is the centerpiece of that stage. In 2018, Putin issued a target that sounded like a command from a boss who never checks the spreadsheet. 80 million tons of cargo a year by 2024. The reality is that 2024 ended with about 37.9 million tons. Record, but still nowhere near the goal. Out of this, only about 3 million tons were transit cargo. The rest were domestic Russian shipments. That gap tells you what the Northern Sea Route currently is. Mostly a domestic artery for Russian projects, not a global alternative that foreign businesses trust. And then come the bottlenecks Russia can talk its way out of. Ice-class shipping, ports, search and rescue, communications, insurance, skilled crews, and sanctions. Arctic LNG 2 shows how these bottlenecks bite. The project started producing in late 2023, then struggled. US sanctions hit the ecosystem around it. Deliveries were delayed. The plant resumed gas processing slowly in early 2025 after a shutdown. But shipments stayed tangled in the reality of sanctions and the shortage of suitable ice-class carriers. Later, Novatek confirmed its first cargo delivery from Arctic LNG 2 to China in 2025. But first cargo is not stable business. Even the Russian government has admitted the larger plan is slipping. In late 2025, Alexander Novak, the deputy prime minister, said sanctions pushed back the target of reaching 100 million tons of LNG output by several years. This is why Putin's Arctic strategy has two faces. One face is propaganda. Giant maps, future tonnage, talk of year-round shipping, talk of a new golden age. The other face is improvisation. That's where weird ideas live, like a proposal to design nuclear-powered LNG carriers in submarine form to move gas through the Arctic faster. Such a thing could never work in real life. That's a desperate attempt to engineer a way around physics, money, and sanctions, while still pretending the plan is unstoppable. Actually, the harsh conditions in the Arctic make it even more appealing for Putin's regime. You can always say the problem is nature, not bad management. The storm did it, the ice did it, the distance did it. Nobody has to admit that the plan was inflated on purpose. The real danger. For the West, the danger is not that Russia becomes rich from the Arctic tomorrow. The danger is that Russia turns the Arctic into a military geometry problem. Look at the map. The shortest lines between North America, Europe, and Russia run across the high north. Missiles, bombers, submarines, early warnings. This is why the Arctic never stopped being strategic. Russia's core advantage in the region is the Kola Peninsula. It's the home of the Northern Fleet and a big chunk of Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent. From Moscow's view, the Arctic is a shield around its most valuable weapons. Now, at the forward bases. Russia has expanded and modernized Arctic infrastructure for years. One example is Nagursk on Franz Joseph Land. It sits deep in the high Arctic, and it has been upgraded alongside nearby facilities like the Arctic Trefoil Base. The point is reach. Another example is air defense and coastal defense systems placed in the Arctic. Russia has deployed modern air defense like S-400 system to Novaya Zemlya, and it has shown off coastal missile systems like Bastion in Arctic bases. The war in Ukraine has not removed that logic. If anything, it hardens it. Western Arctic states are now all in NATO. Russia sees this as encirclement. NATO sees this as risk. So, where does Greenland fit in? When Trump says the US must control Greenland, he is not inventing a new obsession. He's dragging an old military geometry back into daylight. The shortest path for missiles and aircraft across the Atlantic world run through the high north. That's why the US base in northwest Greenland exists at all. Today it's called P2Fix Space Base, and its upgraded early warning radar is tied to ballistic missile warning and missile defense. If you are thinking about Russia's sea-launched and intercontinental missiles, you care about what your radar can see and when. But the current conflict is not really about security, as it is already provided by the P2Fix base. The US holds the right to create more bases on Greenland's territory and deploy more troops if needed through the NATO treaty. And takeover is not necessary for that. The only thing that Trump's recent rhetoric achieved was making Denmark feel cornered. Copenhagen's line is basically, yes, the Arctic security picture is worse. No, the answer is not US control. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, called US acquisition absolutely not necessary, while also acknowledging a new security situation. Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister, has been even more direct, calling it a fundamental disagreement and framing Greenland's defense as a NATO concern, not a real estate deal. In Danish coverage, you can feel the insult behind the diplomacy. Denmark has hosted the US military force for decades, and now it's being treated like a landlord who can be shoved aside. Denmark's move to pull allied forces in closer is not to pick a fight, but to show that Greenland is not a loose end. Now, Greenland's own voice, which is not the same as Denmark's. Greenland's government keeps repeating the obvious sentence that still has to be said. We are not for sale. Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen has rejected the idea outright. The public mood is a mix of anxiety, anger, and a sense of being treated like an object. Greenland also has its own internal tension. Many Greenlanders want more independence over time. But independence is not the same thing as being swallowed by someone louder. And there's also a human edge to this story, the bitter memories that some Greenlanders hold about the US military presence. In 1953, to expand the base area, Greenlandic Inuit families were forcibly relocated from their homes near the Thule district. A small community was moved north to Quanaq, and the legacy became a long, bitter dispute inside Denmark and Greenland. These people were pushed around by decisions made far away. So when today's politicians talk about Greenland like it's a chess piece, Greenlanders hear something else. They hear a story of being treated as a platform. Then comes Russia's point of view, which is never about Greenland as a place. It's about Greenland as a crack. For Moscow, the best Arctic outcome is NATO distracted and divided. A US campaign to control an ally's territory is a propaganda jackpot. Russia gets to point at Western unity and love. At the same time, Denmark, pulling more NATO activity into Greenland, gives Russia a second story. Militarization and confrontation, the language it uses whenever NATO shores up a flank. Either way, Russia benefits from the argument itself. So why is Trump doing this, essentially playing into Russia's hands? Some experts point to Arctic competition with Russia and China. Some point to resources and shipping. Some point to the domestic political theater of dominance. My read is that Trump is performing for his electorate. A big chunk of it enjoys the posture. The target almost doesn't matter as long as someone is being dominated. The Arctic security problem is real. Europe has exactly the same interest as the US in not being threatened by Russian ballistic missiles flying over the Arctic. But if you actually want better protection, you can have it without picking fights with allies. When the tone turns into threats and ownership, it looks less like strategy and more like audience work. If you want more analysis like this, without panic, without slogans, and without pretending the world is simple, please like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who still thinks the Arctic is just polar bears and icebergs. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or SuperThanks. It helps keep this work independent. And if you want behind-the-scenes research for my upcoming novel, The Snow Queen's Spring, sources, scenes, and the human details that don't always fit into a YouTube video, my newsletter is in the description. Now I really want to hear from you in the comments. If there's one reason countries would risk conflict over the Arctic, what is it? Oil and gas? The Northern Sea Route? Missile geometry? Or something else everyone's missing so far? If you pick the fourth option, tell me what it is and why. See you in the next one.